why does this keep happening? The creator of a beloved work of fiction turns out to be a bit of a and now we have to figure out how we square our old feelings about the art with our new feelings about the artist. Harry Potter is different from other examples because it's not just a popular series of books and movies, it was an actual cultural phenomenon. Likewise, Joanne is different from other examples. She's not just posted a few problematic tweets, she has spent her post-Potter career advocating for so-called gender-critical politics, which actively harm the rights of trans people. I'm not going to waste my time arguing whether Joanne is transphobic. For one thing, she's been known to threaten legal action against people who say that. I'm already going to have to qualify anything I say about her as my own opinion. But also, in my opinion, it's obvious she is. And at this stage, anyone who's still of a different opinion is beyond convincing anyway. Trans people are the gender they say they are. Trans rights are human rights, and they deserve rights. If you disagree with that, go f yourself. Although, if you are genuinely unaware of what Joanne's been doing and why people are so upset about it, here are some people who can explain it far better than I could. I'll leave links in the description. But I'm not here to talk about Joanne, I want to talk about Potter. Because I guess I'm a fan. I'm part of the generation who grew up with these books. Reading them was a formative experience for me. But I'm also a member of the LGBTQ+ community and a vocal supporter of trans rights, in solidarity with the trans and non-binary people I know and love. And I'm also a media critic. I have a responsibility to make criticism that is fair, accurate, and honest. So, being honest, I'm a bit conflicted on how I feel about Potter now. A version of this conversation was first had back around 2020. In the aftermath of Joanne's mask off, many Potter fans expressed disappointment, hurt, and betrayal, which they didn't know how to reconcile with their fondness for her books. From this emerged a desire to separate the art from the artist. People jokingly attributed the Potter books to Hatsune Miku, Britney Spears, or even the characters of the books themselves. On Twitter, the trending hashtag RIP JK Rowling was not, as some misinterpreted, a death threat against Joanne, but a reference to Roland Barthes' essay The Death of the Author, which, broadly speaking, argues that a reader's individual interpretation of a work matters more than the author's intent. In other words, fans were arguing they could still participate in the fandom without supporting Joanne. And in response to this, media critics pointed out that Death of the Author is a literary theory, whereas Joanne's call to turfery is not a literary problem. How we interpret her books isn't what matters here. What matters is what she's using her vast wealth and influence to do. She co-founded a women-only sexual violence support centre which excludes trans women. She donated £1 million to the Labour Party and agreed to meet with them over their gender recognition policies. She donated £70,000 to a group opposing self-declaration gender laws, who, earlier this year, successfully campaigned for a Supreme Court ruling that the Equality Act refers to biological sex. This has complicated legal implications, but other organizations are using the ruling to justify policy discriminating against trans people, as encouraged by the goddamn Prime Minister. And now Joanne set up the J.K. Rowling Women's Fund so she can financially support even more gender-critical legal cases. Meanwhile, the Potter capitalist machine continues to mine Joanne's intellectual property for movies, TV shows, merchandise, and theme park rides. According to Forbes, Joanne has recently regained billionaire status. Whoopee! We know Joanne's contracts with both Warner Brothers and Universal require her to be involved in any Potter project they produce, which means when we purchase Potter products, we are indirectly funding anti-trans causes. This is not about Death of the Author, because Joanne is very much still alive and still profiting from Potter. The verdict is simple: don't give Joanne your money. As such, there's been an increasing push to boycott Potter, mainly targeting new Potter products, such as the Hogwarts Legacy video game and the upcoming HBO TV adaptation. And there are some who believe the boycott should also extend to any Potter-related activity, such as writing fanfiction, dressing in cosplay, or even just posting memes. Because while Joanne doesn't profit from these things directly, publicly participating in the fandom could serve as promotion for the franchise, or a tacit endorsement of Joanne's views. It might even give the impression you are unsafe for trans people to be around. Sadly, however, the boycott has so far not been very effective. The Potter brand has been damaged to some extent by the backlash to Joanne, but it didn't stop Hogwarts Legacy from selling 12 million copies. There are some who suggest the calls to boycott may actually have brought more attention to the game. And while that's disappointing, it's also not very surprising. Transphobia is rampant these days, although I suspect a lot of people who continue to pay for Potter are normies who just aren't engaged with the issue and either don't know or care to know what it has to do with them. People should participate in the boycott. I hope more people do in future, but we should also be realistic about what the boycott can achieve. Joanne is already obscenely rich, and even if the HBO show is a flop, she's gonna carry on advocating against trans rights, in my opinion. Regardless, it's still important to register our complaint. We can't let this go uncontested. And the boycott means any new Potter products generate controversy just by existing, which forces studios to put out statements addressing it, which keeps the issue in the public conversation. Even if we can't defund Joanne, we should at least make it as bad for business as possible to work with her. And no matter what the boycott achieves, I'm still gonna participate, simply because I don't like the thought of even 1 penny of mine going towards anti-trans causes. But what about this? This is my personal copy of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It's a 3rd edition. My mum bought it for me when I was about 10 years old, and it's sat on my bookshelf ever since, soon joined by the other 6 books. Like many fans, I got rid of all my Potter merch when it stopped sparking joy. But I kept this because I guess I might want to read it again one day. And at least this copy was bought long before anyone knew about Joanne's views. Any harm this purchase caused is long since done, and it wasn't my money that paid for it anyway. So if I read this in the privacy of my own home, that doesn't hurt anyone, right? So why does it feel so icky? Well, her prose does leave a bit to be desired. Alongside the discussion about the ethics of purchasing Potter, there's also been, let's call it, a critical reinterpretation. A new wave of video essays, op-eds, tweet threads, and forum posts re-examining Potter as a literary work. In other words, making the case that Potter is bad, actually. Now, there's a lot we can criticize about Potter, but bad can mean different things. Sometimes people mean Potter is artistically bad. It's not just that the author is transphobic, in their opinion, she's also just a bad writer. This often comes from people who never liked Potter in the first place and are feeling very smug now. But I also see people using this as further justification for the boycott. We should all give up Potter because it's not worth reading anyway. And I'm sorry, but that feels like a cope. I'm not saying we all have to carry on liking Potter, but just because Joanne's come out as a gibbon doesn't mean her books are any better or worse than they've always been. It's just too convenient to suddenly decide now that her books never had any artistic merit. I don't care if you think her world building is bad or the time turners are a plot hole. What has that got to do with transphobia? Other times, however, when people say Potter is bad actually, they mean ideologically bad. Knowing what we now know about Joanne has cast her work in a new light. It offers new explanations for some of her creative decisions, and it may be that her current views are more apparent in Potter than we realized at the time. Most of us were literal children when we first read these books, and now we know more about the issues she was writing about, not just because we grew up, but because of, well, gestures at everything. Potter used to be on a pedestal, where any criticism was brushed off as intellectual snobbery or moral panic, because often that is what it was. So maybe we needed Joanne's castle to fall for us to be able to have this conversation. So we actually do have a death of the author problem on our hands here. Theoretically, learning that your favourite childhood author isn't who they seemed to be needn't change the way you feel about their books. However, over here in reality, it absolutely does. And it doesn't help that Potter just so happens to be the best-selling book series of all time. For those who weren't around during Pottermania, I'm not sure I can express just how massive it was. Potter was everywhere. Families camped outside bookshops on launch night. The New York Times had to make a separate bestseller list for children's literature. It helped bring fantasy into the mainstream. It revitalized the young adult genre. And now it's become embedded in our culture. Everyone knows what a Hufflepuff or a Muggle is. It's not so easy to just put all that back in its bottle and throw that bottle back in the sea. Sooner or later, we are gonna have to confront what Potter means to us now. It's a difficult conversation because it's connected to issues people quite rightly feel very strongly about. And I fully expect Joanne to get worse, so it's only gonna get more difficult. The lives of trans people are more important than some fantasy book series from 20 years ago. Maybe the sensible thing would be to just avoid the subject. However, my view is best summed up by academic Cecilia Concha Farr. In response to the MLA withdrawing support for her Potter essay anthology, presumably as a result of the Joanne controversy, Farr called their decision a mistake, arguing that it's the role of literary scholars
to help readers negotiate the complex relationship between authors and texts.
So that's what I want to do. Or I'm going to try anyway, because I'm surely not the only one who had a strong relationship to these books which they feel conflicted about now, and I think it might help to talk about that. I spent the last 6 odd months reading stuff people have written about Potter across the years, and now I'm going to put it all on the table and we're going to talk about it. Which means I'm going to talk a lot of about Potter. If you're a superfan, you're going to have to brace yourself for that. But I'm also going to talk about criticism that is inaccurate or unfair, and I will defend Potter where I think it's warranted, so be prepared for that too. And I'm going to talk about criticism that is complicated. Sometimes I will make arguments for the sake of argument, which means I might say something that I disagree with. Or I might say something that is not untrue, but isn't the whole story. I'm just saying, this is a conversation. And it's by having the conversation that I hope to make some sense out of this, to see if I can figure out what Potter means and whether that's changed. So let's start with the most pressing question. Part 1. Should we have known?
When so many adult critics were carrying on about the incredible originality of the first Harry Potter book, I read it to find out what the fuss was about, and remained somewhat puzzled. It seemed a lively kid's fantasy crossed with a school novel. Good fare for its age group, but stylistically ordinary, imaginatively derivative, and ethically rather mean-spirited.
Stylistically ordinary, I guess is fair. Imaginatively derivative, well, Le Guin wrote about a magic school first, but ethically mean-spirited? Is that really true? Unsurprisingly, this quote from 2004 has been doing the rounds again more recently. Le Guin is a juggernaut of children's fantasy, whose work has often been compared to Potter. And some suggest this quote proves Le Guin clocked Joanne as a bigot all the way back then, which I'd say is a generous interpretation of mean-spirited, but clearly Le Guin clocked something the rest of us didn't. The reason Joanne's actions are so often seen as a betrayal is because of how antithetical they are to what we, as fans, interpreted as the core message of her books.
We find the use of her influence and privilege to target marginalised people to be out of step with the message of acceptance and empowerment we find in her books and celebrated by the Harry Potter community.
The central theme of Potter is the power of love and acceptance conquering hate and persecution. It's a story about thwarting an evil authoritarian rise to power. It's about defeating bigotry. Congratulations, Joanne! You don't understand your own books.
I'm constantly told I don't understand my own books. I'm constantly told that I have betrayed my own books. My position is that I am absolutely upholding the positions that I took in Potter.
Oops. So Joanne doesn't see any incompatibility with what she believes now and what she wrote then. How do we make sense of that? Well, according to the reinterpretation, it makes perfect sense. There are many things in Potter we might call problematic. For instance, the Gringotts goblins resemble anti-Semitic caricatures. The house elves are a race of slaves who enjoy being enslaved. Dudley Dursley and other overweight characters are described with fatphobic language. Most non-white or non-British characters have stereotypical or cartoonish names. Cho Chang's ethnicity is unclear, and her name is made up. Hermione's campaign for house elf liberation frames her comedically as an ignorant busybody. Dumbledore's homosexuality is not made explicit anywhere in the books and is only confirmed in external sources. Joanne described her werewolves as an allegory for AIDS, whilst also featuring a villainous werewolf who attacks and deliberately infects children. And seriously, Joanne, what were you even trying to say with the house elves? Sure, there's a lot here that raises an eyebrow, but it was a different time? Okay, it wasn't that long ago, but Joanne wasn't the only writer back then doing ignorant stuff like this. And none of these things outright suggest transphobia. The subject of trans people never even comes up in the Potter books. That's not what Joanne says.
My position is that this activist movement, in the form that it's currently taking, echoes the very thing that I was warning against in Harry Potter.
God damn it, Joanne. I should mention here that the podcast's PR firm claims Joanne was referring to the trans activist movement, not trans people in general. I don't hate trans people, just the ones who advocate for their own rights, is my personal interpretation of that statement. The point is, according to the reinterpretation, these common criticisms reveal a pattern of attitudes connected to, in their opinion, Joanne's bigotry, a pattern which persists and even gets worse in her later work. Despite Dumbledore's romantic relationship with Grindelwald being a key plot point, the Fantastic Beasts films only feature occasional flimsy references to his sexuality. Pottermore's international expansion of the wizarding world is even more stereotypical and often downright ignorant of other cultures, accused of being appropriative and colonialist. And we see more fatphobia, most notably in The Casual Vacancy, in which Joanne writes a passage about how seeing an unsympathetic character's large belly prompts most people to wonder how he's able to use his no, Joanne. Actually, most people don't think about that when they see a fat person. Feels like you're telling on yourself here. And this pattern leads to, in my opinion, overt transphobia in her Cormoran Strike novels, including an unsympathetically described trans character and a serial killer who cross-dresses to prey on women, the most basic transphobic fear. According to the reinterpretation, this pattern in Joanne's writing suggests a more mean-spirited worldview than perhaps even she is aware of, and may explain how she is able to write a story opposing bigotry, whilst, in my opinion, failing to identify bigotry within herself. Now, I ought to stress we can't know what's going on in Joanne's head. Apart from the endless writhing of worms, obviously. I'm not claiming to prove anything about Joanne, but I am going to use the word suggests a lot. I'm also not going to go over every argument the reinterpretation has made, because there's a lot of it. You can check that out on your own time. What I'm going to do is make my own case for what I see as their two most common and most compelling interpretations. Let's ruin some childhoods! Interpretation 1. Essentialism. The main conflict in the Potter series pits our heroes against Voldemort and his Death Eaters, an authoritarian group who discriminate based on blood purity, the idea that Muggle-born witches and wizards are inherently inferior to those of pure blood, a bigoted ideology which the narrative outright disproves.
I mean, the rest of us know it doesn't make any difference at all. Look at Neville Longbottom. He's pure blood, and he can hardly stand a cauldron the right way up.
And they haven't invented a spell our Hermione can't do,
said Hagrid proudly.
So we can sum up the main message of Potter as basic non-essentialism, opposing the idea that people are born with inherent talents and qualities which make them good or bad.
It matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be.
Except when it comes to gender, apparently. And, as we've already mentioned, fat people. Potter has long been criticised for the language it uses to describe overweight characters, particularly Dudley Dursley. If you haven't read the books in a while, you may have forgotten quite how egregious it is. The text frequently draws attention to his massive backside, his multiple chins. He's described as waddling. He's literally dehumanized by being likened to a pig, or, on one occasion, a young killer whale. Which suggests Joanne has a particular fixation on, even disgust for, overweight people. In response to this criticism, back in 2007, fansite MuggleNet posted a rebuttal, pointing out other overweight characters in Potter, like Hagrid and Molly Weasley, whose weights are treated incidentally. Since none of the outright evil characters are fat, the post argued fatness is not a moral indictment in Potter, and Joanne made a similar statement. Interestingly, the MuggleNet post no longer exists. Perhaps because they realised that's bull. Fatness may not be a moral indictment for Molly, but for Dudley, it is. There's a big difference between describing Molly as plump and calling Dudley a pig in a wig. YouTuber OK to be Fat argues that Dudley is an example of the fat bully trope, where a bully uses their size to exert power over smaller children, even though statistics show children are more likely to be bullied for their weight than anything else. The text doesn't just demonize Dudley for being a bully, it demonizes him for being fat. In fact, the inconsistent treatment of overweight characters may speak to a broader criticism. In Lauren R. Camachi's essay, The Face of Evil, she argues Potter's character descriptions frequently involve physiognomy, the debunked pseudoscience popular with eugenicists in the early 20th century, which claims a person's character and morals can be discerned through their facial features. Now, Camachi isn't suggesting Joanne is a closet eugenicist. She argues that physiognomic ideas live on in what she describes as beauty bias, the tendency to portray good guys as attractive while portraying bad guys as ugly. It's not just fat characters who are dehumanized as animals. Petunia is horsey, Snape is bat-like, Pansy Parkinson has a pug-like face, and Umbridge is so caricatured as a toad with her broad flabby face, slack mouth, and bulging eyes that Camachi argues it's not humanly possible. And if our opinion of a character is supposed to change, so too do their descriptions. Tom Riddle is handsome as a youth, but Lord Voldemort is gaunt, pale, and literally snake-like. Sirius Black is first described as waxy, gaunt, and corpse-like, but becomes handsome and full-faced in later books. A transformation not shared by his evil cousin and fellow prisoner of Azkaban, Bellatrix. Even Dudley goes on a diet and becomes muscular before his mild redemption in Book 7. Okay, but Gilderoy Lockhart is both unsympathetic and handsome, until his cowardice is exposed, and he's described as not remotely handsome anymore. But Mad-Eye Moody is mysterious, intimidating, and turns out to be a Death Eater in disguise. Look, I'm not going to litigate every character. The point is, Joanne does this a lot. The reason she does this, according to Camachi, is to encourage readers to make a quick moral judgment about her characters, especially unsympathetic ones. And, in fairness, there is a history of this device, especially in children's literature. Roald Dahl, Charles Dickens, and the Bronte sisters all did it. But Komachi argues that, in the modern day, and in a story attempting to portray a morally complex world, it sends a mixed message.
It collapses the moral middle ground, but even more damningly, teaches readers that evil is visible in physical appearances. Adult readers know that this is a literary device, but would younger readers come to the same conclusion? Or would this offer a confusing lesson?
And some have connected this directly to transphobia, pointing out how Rita Skeeter's overly feminine fashion sense is contrasted against her heavy jaw, mannish hands, and surprising strength. It's possible Skeeter is intended to be a transphobic derision of trans women. I mean, her MO is sneaking into places in disguise. But even if Joanne didn't do this consciously, it still suggests she connects masculinity in women with ugliness, and therefore badness. This I would call ethically mean-spirited. It's not just that the text describes its unsympathetic characters as ugly, it derisively caricatures certain traits, certain sorts of people. Like how lavender brown is used to mock gossipy girly girls, or how the literal first sentence of the first book is a joke mocking the Dursleys for their prudishness. Characters are derided less for what they do, but what they are. For instance, when Dudley receives comeuppance, it often targets his weight. Hagrid curses him to have a pig's tail, which he needs to get surgically removed. Fred and George lure him into cheating on his diet by eating a tongue toffee, which makes his tongue magically swell. By contrast, as YouTuber Sean points out, when Draco insults Molly's weight in Goblet of Fire, our heroes respond with outrage in a way they don't when Dudley is ridiculed for the same thing.
So is it wrong to make fun of someone for being overweight? And the answer is, it depends on if you're a good or a bad person, and whether your target is a good or a bad person.
So there is a kind of essentialism going on here. The world is split into good people and bad people. And as Sean goes on to argue, the morality of an action in Potter, short of full-on murder, largely depends on which team you're on. And there's a lot of team spirit in Potter. Most obviously, the Hogwarts houses. As part of a wizard's induction into the wizarding world, they are divided into categories, which define them for their entire education and even into adulthood, based on a magical assessment of their character at 11 years old. Even if blood purity is proven nonsense, clearly there are essential qualities on which a person can be judged. It's a eugenicist's wet dream. In fairness, the narrative does attempt to deconstruct the sorting. There are exceptions to the rule: Slughorn, Wormtail, and, let's not forget, Severus Snape. As Dumbledore says to him,
I sometimes think we sort too soon.
After the Battle of Hogwarts, the victors celebrate in the Great Hall, no longer sitting according to house, symbolically dismantling the whole idea. Yet in the epilogue, it's clear the sorting still exists as it always has. Nevertheless, the epilogue also reaffirms that Harry was able to choose his house. Another quote from Dumbledore.
It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities.
Except you can't choose not to be sorted. Choosing between Gryffindor and Slytherin is still framed as a choice between siding with the good guys or the bad guys. Nearly all the heroes are Gryffindors, and nearly all the villains are Slytherins. None of the Slytherin students join the final battle against Voldemort. The bad students come from bad families, as if badness is genetic.
No Malfoy is worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is.
Likewise, Harry's goodness appears genetic. He is naturally gifted at Quidditch, just like his father. His Patronus is a stag, just like his father's. He was able to survive Voldemort's killing curse because of a magical boon granted by his mother. He had a whole existential crisis when he learned his father used to be a bully. Harry's blood is just as important to him as any Death Eater. And while we're here, what's more essentialist than magic? In Potter, magic is something you're born with, which divides humanity into two classes: Muggles and Wizards, the normals and the specials. The whole escapist fantasy of Potter is our hero discovering he has magical powers, which let him leave the ordinary world behind to join a secret club of other special people. Well, that is part of the fun of it. And there's deconstruction of this too. The villains see themselves as superior to muggles, magic is might, etc. We're supposed to disagree with that. And yet, it's not just the villains who exhibit anti-muggle sentiment. The very word muggle is often used as an insult, almost like a slur.
If he wants to go, a great muggle like you won't stop him.
I'm a muggle, I can say that. Wait, that's right, I'm not a muggle anymore. Oh god.
She just fainted.
I'm sorry.
Even Arthur Weasley, who is fascinated by muggles, views them with a superiority that is both affectionate and patronizing.
Ingenious, really. How many ways muggles have found of getting along without magic?
Okay, but that one's a joke. As readers, it's funny to see wizards treating muggles, essentially ourselves, as the other, that the mundane world is mysterious and exotic to them. But that still comes from a place of superiority, as critical writing student Vicky Gavin writes.
Arthur's attitudes express and reinforce the idea that muggles are inherently different from wizards, and the separation between muggles and wizards is natural.
All wizards, not just the villains, see themselves as essentially superior to muggles. Our heroes disagree with the villains not because they see muggles as equals, the disagreement is they think muggles should be segregated instead of subjugated.
Since the disdain for muggles stems from racial lines rather than ability or merit, muggles are hard-pressed to be seen as positive members of society.
Another Sean observation is that while bigotry against Muggleborns is proven incorrect, it's not proven immoral. Pointing out that magical talent doesn't correlate with blood status accepts the logic of the bigots and only disagrees with their conclusion. So, if it's wrong to be bigoted against Muggleborns because we can prove they're equally magical, does that mean it's okay to be bigoted against Muggles because they aren't magical at all? What we end up with is a story which proclaims a message of non-essentialism whilst frequently presenting its characters through an assumed essentialist worldview. It both doesn't matter what you're born as, and it absolutely does.
Rowling wants to have her cake and eat it too. To have Harry, the fairy tale hero born to greatness, and yet promote a social vision in which only merit counts.
According to the reinterpretation, this essentialism not only suggests unconscious biases on Joanne's part, certainly in regards to fat phobia and beauty bias, but also suggests the reason she's unable to recognize those biases. As YouTuber Hoots puts it,
Joanne has a very individualist, black and white sense of good and bad, and since she knows herself to be a good person who does nice things like give to charity, people telling her that she has done bad things just doesn't compute.
And while it would be absurd to suggest Joanne secretly harbours anti-Muggle sentiments, the fact she puts this big ontological divide in her fictional world without feeling the need to address it suggests she doesn't recognise it as a problem. Which brings us to the second complaint. Interpretation 2. Systemic injustice.
I wanted Harry to leave our world and find exactly the same problems in the wizarding world. So you have the intent to impose a hierarchy, you have bigotry, and this notion of purity.
Potter uses fantasy to allegorize real-world prejudices and inequalities, not just with blood purity and anti-Muggle sentiments, but also with corruption in the Ministry, the treatment of magical creatures, and class divides. Well, I guess class isn't a fantasy allegory, even if the currency is whimsical. Obviously, the books frame these things as bad, problems which must be solved. And yet, by the end of the series, after Voldemort is defeated and the war is won, the wizarding world is left pretty much the same as we found it. Okay, things have changed. The nice wizards have regained power, and in interviews, Joanne describes our heroes going on to implement a whole bunch of political reforms. The issue is, these reforms are individual solutions to systemic problems.
Above an individual level, nothing changes for the better. Flawed systems are portrayed, but the answer to those flaws is always to replace the individual assumed to be responsible for them. The system itself is above being questioned.
And this, the reinterpretation argues, is symptomatic of Joanne's politics as a centrist Blairite neoliberal, emphasizing individual responsibility over state intervention and offering no substantial systemic change.
I think Joanne's centrism feeds into her kind of individualist view of the world. So when she presented her story with systemic problems, she could really only imagine these kind of myopic, meritocratic solutions to them.
And the most oft-cited example of this is the house elves, a race of creatures magically bound to serve wizards of a particular household. The natural parallel to draw here is slavery. That's what Hermione and Dobby call it, and many academics have made the same comparison. Bethany Barrett writes that house elves occupy a very similar role in wizard society as slaves of the antebellum South. Bricken Carey finds parallels with abolitionist literature, Creature, the grateful slave, and Dobby, the abolitionist martyr. Meanwhile, Rivka Tamima Kellner draws a parallel to the oppression of women, house elves being unemancipated housekeepers. But in spite of all this, Joanne makes the unusual choice to present house elves as willing slaves. Servitude is simply in their nature, which not only is a very essentialist idea, but also raises questions about what Joanne thinks of slavery. Infamously, the only character who questions this arrangement is Hermione, much to the chagrin of her friends. Even Harry, despite having freed Dobby, is indifferent to her activism, often irritated by it, and the house elves themselves resist her attempts to liberate them. Complete with her embarrassing acronym SPEW, the whole thing seems to be played for laughs.
Hermione takes the house elf cause seriously, but Rowling does not take Hermione seriously.
Okay, this is a hell of a thing to devil's advocate for, but here goes. As academic Alyssa Lowry argues, it may be unproductive to equate the dehumanization of real-life slaves with fantasy creatures who are literally not human.
Elves, definitively, are of a separate species, and that species has its own separate mythology and history, separating it from the empowered wizards. Any conflation of enslaved Africans with house elves immediately reifies the dehumanizing barrier at the very root of anti-black racism.
The parallels are there, nobody's denying the parallels, but it's not a one-to-one allegory. Unlike real slaves, there's no indication that wizards deliberately enslaved house elves or abducted them from their homeland. I mean, we don't know they didn't. We don't actually learn much about house elf mythology and history. But we do know Potter draws a lot from European folklore. There's a big similarity between house elves and brownies, small, impish creatures who enjoy performing chores unseen in the dead of night, who are offended by the offer of wages and will leave the house forever if presented with clothes. In all likelihood, this is where Joanne got the idea. Now, I'm not going to say she's beyond making clumsy allusions to marginalized groups. Looking at you, Kingsley Shacklebolt. Nevertheless, as Lowry argues, it may actually be more useful to analyse house elves as their own unique case study of social inequality. So why do the house elves resist Hermione's attempts to liberate them? Drawing a real-life slavery parallel might explain this as a result of their own internalized repression, what Barrett identifies as false consciousness. That's Hermione's explanation too. She describes the elves as uneducated and brainwashed. On the other hand, if we take the text at its word that servitude genuinely is the natural state of house elves, Hermione's activism begins to look more insensitive. While she initially acts more like a union boss, campaigning for fair wages and working conditions, Lowry argues the reason she ultimately fails is because her approach becomes assimilationist. She leaves clothes around the Gryffindor common room in the hopes house elves will unwittingly free themselves while cleaning. In other words, forcing them to change against their wishes.
Hermione has ceased to recognize elves as disenfranchised, unfairly treated members of the service industry, and has instead begun to see them as an ignorant racial group in need of a fundamental change to their ways of thinking and relating to the world.
However, even Lowry describes her interpretation as a negotiated reading. As per Stuart Hall's reception theory, a negotiated reading accepts some aspects of the author's intent while rejecting others. For instance, what about Dobby? If the narrative wants us to believe servitude is an inherent part of house elf culture, and this arrangement is fine actually, how come the most prominent elf character we meet is the one exception? If Joanne was trying to make a point about respecting foreign cultures, Dobby undermines it. An elf who wants to be free throws their natural subservience into question. And whether house elves genuinely want to be enslaved or not, the text makes clear they're mistreated by wizards either way. Not just because Dobby was abused by the Malfoys, but also because all magical creatures are victims of discrimination. They're not allowed wands, they have no representation in government, and the Ministry's Fountain of Magical Brethren represents wizards' perception of themselves at the top of the hierarchy, which the narrative very clearly frames as an error on their part.
The fountain we destroyed tonight told a lie. We wizards have mistreated and abused our fellows for far too long, and we are now reaping our reward.
So even within the context of the narrative, house elves are victims of systemic injustice. Even if Hermione's activism is meant to be read as misguided, the text still frames her as basically correct in identifying the injustice.
And Hermione kept telling us to be nice to Creature. She was quite right, Harry, said Dumbledore.
And how does Joanne resolve this injustice? Basically, she doesn't. I mean, she tries, kind of. The victory scene in the Great Hall also describes humans and non-humans sitting together as equals. And yet, only a few pages later, the last ever mention of a house elf in the entire series, effectively the conclusion of their story, is Harry wondering whether Creature might bring him a sandwich. Creature was abused by his former masters. He fought alongside Harry in the battle, yet it's still assumed his welfare comes second to Harry's. The hierarchy is left unchanged.
A liberal gesture is generally understood as implying that all races are essentially equal, but where such a gesture seems to be located in the Harry Potter books, only magical races that are unequal are presented.
It's difficult to draw a solid conclusion on house elves, since the text itself doesn't draw much of a conclusion. Joanne is often criticised for poor world building, which I don't always think is fair, but what I will criticise is how surprisingly incurious she seems to be about the implications of the world she invents. Where do house elves come from? Who decides which families they serve? Why are they bound by a magical contract? Why do they have humans at the Ministry in charge of their interests? The text not only leaves these questions unanswered, but also unasked. Despite all these academics attempting to tease out Joanne's meaning, could it just be that she didn't think any of this through? The most charitable reading of this conclusion, as Carey describes, is that not all problems can be fixed in one day. We gotta defeat Voldemort first so we can liberate house elves later. And in interviews, Joanne seems to support that view, describing Hermione's future career working in the Ministry to improve the lives of house elves. Improve their lives, sure, but without changing the system which led to their discrimination in the first place.
What seems clear throughout is that Rowling sees house elf enslavement as an institution that is capable of much improvement, but which cannot be eradicated.
Even if the text agrees with Hermione that there's an injustice here, it disagrees with her methods. In the end, she doesn't change the system. What she does change is that both Harry and Ron learn to be more conscientious about house elves. Harry treats Creature with respect and dignity, and is rewarded with a loyal servant. Ron remembers to save the Hogwarts house elves during the final battle, and is rewarded with a girlfriend. The problem which gets addressed is not the house elves' position in society, but the way their masters treat them. Thus, the less charitable reading is that
it does not matter whether slavery is overthrown, just as long as the erstwhile emancipators do their bit.
We don't get rid of slavery, we just replace the bad slave owners with good ones. We don't question Muggle segregation, we just make sure nobody is mean to Muggles. We don't change our corrupt and ineffectual system of government, we just put the right people in positions of power. The system itself is never questioned. And I think the reinterpretation is right that you can see this attitude reflected in Joanne's politics.
To those who seek to tell me that I don't understand my own books, I will say this. Some of you have not understood the books. My position is that this activist movement, in the form that it's currently taking, echoes the very thing that I was warning against in Harry Potter. The Death Eaters claimed we have been made to live in secret, and now is our time. And any who stand in our way must be destroyed. If you disagree with us, you must die.
This claim is absurd on its face. Death Eaters are deliberately analogous to Nazis, who persecuted and killed trans people. This comparison is not only objectively wrong, it's offensive. Obviously, this quote reveals a lot about Joanne's perception of trans activism, but I think it's just as revealing about her perception of Death Eaters. Death Eaters resemble Nazis only in the broadest sense. A charismatic leader and his followers assume power so they can put their bigoted ideology into practice. But where the Nazis were a populist fascist movement that rose to power legally, for the most part, the Death Eaters seize power through what is effectively a military coup. The Nazis used their bigoted ideology to appeal to the frustrated middle and working classes. But the Death Eaters don't appeal to the populace, they just are bigots who seize power to do bigotry. Joanne doesn't actually appear to know that much about the Nazis. She's been accused of Holocaust denial for insinuating the raid on the Institute of Sexual Science didn't happen, and she was, quote, chilled to discover she invented the idea of blood purity without realizing she was echoing the Nazis' ideology. Did she just not do any research? In fairness, I don't think Potter was intended to be read as an Animal Farm-style parable. It's more like how the Empire in Star Wars represents generic imperialism. The Death Eaters represent generic authoritarianism. Or is it that Joanne just has a simple understanding of what authoritarianism is?
And then we come to the famous two-word slogan, the stock phrase, no debate, no debate, no debate. I can't think of a purer instance of authoritarianism than no debate. In fact, that is the attitude of the fundamentalist. You may not challenge my ideas. That makes you evil.
So, trans people are authoritarian because they're unwilling to put their own rights up for debate? This is an argument Contra has already dealt with.
I think that to be authoritarian, you have to be able to leverage authority, and trans people are in a weak position.
I guess Joanne forgot that Voldemort wasn't defeated by debate. The main problem Voldemort poses is he seeks power. He wants to control the wizarding world, to subjugate muggles, to gain the Elder Wand, to become immortal. He doesn't target Harry because of bigotry. Harry isn't even muggle-born. By the way, weird choice in an anti-bigotry story that the protagonist is not a target of bigotry. Literally, the first thing Hagrid says to Harry when he learns about blood purity is, "Don't worry, that doesn't affect you." To Voldemort, Harry is just an obstacle on his route to power. And Harry opposes Voldemort because he threatens the world Harry has come to call home. So, is Voldemort bad because he's furthering a bigoted ideology? Or is it because he disrupts the status quo, because he challenges the system? This next take is most definitely just my opinion, but the only way I can explain Joanne comparing Death Eaters to trans activism is if, more than just being unable to conceive of systemic change, she actually views all systemic change as dangerous, be it subjugating Muggleborns or redefining gender. It's pure conservatism. Yes, the Potter books present a very clear anti-bigotry message, but they also present a simplified understanding of what bigotry is. In the real world, bigotry is first and foremost a systemic issue, assumed prejudices built into the structures of our society. And Potter presents many systemic bigotries built into the structures of wizarding society. Nevertheless, it treats bigotry as an individual problem. It assumes that if you remove bigots from the system, then Wingardium Leviosa, bigotry solved. But outside of surface-level reforms, the root causes of these bigotries are overlooked. Rereading Potter now, I find the slavery and the fat phobia so off-putting, I can't believe there was ever a time when it passed me by. And Potter so frequently contradicts its own messaging that it's difficult to believe that message was ever sincere. Le Guin was right. This has always been there. Yes, it's there. But is it all that's there? Part 2. Can we still like Potter? Reinterpretations of Potter often end with a disclaimer reassuring their audience that if you're a Potter fan and Potter still means something to you, that's okay. You're not a bad person just because you like Joanne's books. And while I'm sure they're sincere about that, it does ring a bit hollow when it comes right after a detailed argument about the bigoted worldview underpinning the entire story. If it is okay to like Potter, why is it okay?
I'm just like so into Harry Potter, but also, can I say turfs? Can I say turfs? Turfs. And it is, I still maintain though that there is so much in there that you know, resonated with a lot of us misfits, a lot of us kids that wanted magic and really believed in it, and I will never let that part go. But turfs.
I want to offer a counter-argument to the reinterpretation, but I don't want to do a non-committal, centristy, there's good and bad points on both sides type deal. I don't disagree with the reinterpretation, at least not in the points I've mentioned. Nevertheless, the reinterpretation heavily relies on deciphering Joanne's politics and beliefs. I want to explore what else Potter means that doesn't involve her. In other words, I want to try and kill the author. In Death of the Author, Bart doesn't actually say the author should be ignored entirely. What he's criticising is the idea of the author, capital A, as a singular voice with a singular meaning. A text doesn't exist independently of the language, media, and culture which surrounds it. So it's limiting to interpret a text as having just one meaning which the author intended.
To give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with a final signification, to close the writing.
Likewise, I think it's limiting to only interpret Potter through the lens of Joanne. For one thing, it can lead to short-sighted conclusions. In his essay, Harry Potter and the Cauldron of Media Illiteracy, blogger Rory argues that legitimate criticism of Potter is often undermined by a desire to discredit Joanne. One example he cites are the accusations that Potter's goblins are anti-Semitic. This is a loaded topic, so I'm going to tread carefully here. Rory, speaking as a Jewish man himself, argues that while the movie's depiction of goblins strongly resemble anti-Semitic caricatures, that's less true of the goblins' descriptions in the books. While it is true that putting goblins in charge of a bank evokes medieval depictions of Jewish bankers, and there are complications around the depiction of Griphook, Rory argues the legitimate criticism here is that Joanne is thoughtlessly regurgitating fantasy tropes which are rooted in anti-Semitism. By itself, this doesn't prove she's an outright anti-Semite, and yet that's what she's often accused of.
I find this far more offensive than I find Rowling's actual text, because it cynically uses accusations of anti-Semitism to fabricate a narrative. It's as if it's not enough for Rowling to be profoundly transphobic, she needs to be more of a bigot, or else it doesn't count. It undermines the more credible things you can accuse Harry Potter and Rowling of when you're so conspicuously looking to interpret things in bad faith that you start misreading the book's literal text.
It's not my place to comment on how anti-Semitic the goblins are, but Rory's argument does remind me of the way people criticise Joanne's handling of Dumbledore's homosexuality, which I absolutely can comment on. Infamously, Joanne revealed Dumbledore was gay after the final book was already published, which many interpreted as a publicity stunt to keep the books relevant after the series was complete. Really? You think the author of Harry Potter thought her books weren't getting enough publicity?
Was that something that was just thrown out for the American press to get them stirred up a bit? No.
So it did.
So it did.
Joanne only revealed this detail to the public in a Q&A after being specifically asked about Dumbledore's love life. And she told a story, which others have corroborated, about script drafts of Half-Blood Prince being altered because Joanne shared this detail with screenwriter Steve Kloves. So I think it's unlikely she made it up just to generate press. If she'd never been asked about it, maybe we'd never have found out at all. My issue with Dumbledore is that after Joanne became the most successful children's author of all time, she had the opportunity to make his sexuality visible in the text, and for whatever reason, chose not to.
You could have done it. You would have had to fight your senses and all that, but you could have done it and you should have done it.
I also can't help noticing when she talks about this, she often words it like,
I always thought of Dumbledore as gay.
But I always saw Dumbledore as gay.
As if her interpretation is just one of many. For an author who is normally quite word of God about her books, it's interesting she's less committal about this.
I liked leaving it open.
But while I think that's pretty cowardly, and especially cowardly to keep doing it in the Fantastic Beasts films, the legitimate criticism here is that she didn't do as much for gay representation as she could have, not that she only did it for the attention. It doesn't benefit us to vilify Joanne as more monstrous than she actually is. For one, it makes our arguments less credible, but for two, bigotry is not monstrous, it's mundane. Joanne is in an exceptional position, but she's not an exceptional person, she's ordinary. Ordinary people do bigotry every day. When we view bigotry as the behaviour of inhuman villains, it makes it harder to recognise bigotry in our ordinary lives. Nevertheless, I understand the impulse to assume the worst of Joanne. She does keep on disappointing us. Maybe tomorrow she'll tweet something unquestionably homophobic or anti-Semitic, and I'll regret giving her the benefit of the doubt here. But even then, what's in the text is what's in the text. Potter was completed more than a decade before Joanne's polyjuice potion wore off. The thing which prompted the reinterpretation is entirely external to the books. If Joanne had done the sensible thing and kept her opinions to herself, would we still be having this conversation? In Rory's blog post, he describes how, a decade ago, his interpretation of Potter was regarded as dismissive or shallow, whereas now he's accused of being a Potter apologist, even though his interpretation hasn't changed. He says it's a mistake to interpret Potter as a sophisticated social commentary. Sure, it's a moral parable and it deals with some heavy ideas, but Rory argues it's also deeply unserious. A sport played on broomsticks, textbooks that bite, staircases which like to move, platform 9 3/4. The wizarding world is whimsical. The Dursleys are not just opposed to magic, they're opposed to fun and nonsense. Whereas Dumbledore, the voice of wisdom in this story, delights in nonsense. Silliness is a virtue in Potter. So there's a level of irony there which Rory argues both the reinterpretation and hardcore fans overlook. I also just think Potter suffers sometimes for being a political fantasy. Like, I've seen people sincerely criticise the Wizards' judicial system as if Joanne is genuinely advocating for magic Alcatraz guarded by depression monsters. Just because flawed systems are depicted doesn't necessarily mean they are endorsed. Yes, Potter's irony is often used thoughtlessly, satirising things in a way which is reductive or harmful, like the fat phobia, the stereotypical names, and the clumsy allegories. And that should be criticised. But Rory argues it's an illegitimate criticism to dismiss Potter out of hand as immoral trash, because it's not meant to be taken quite so seriously as it often is. I'd say Rory may be giving the books a bit too much credit. For instance, he describes house elves as a plotline about liberating an enslaved populace, which, no it isn't, they literally weren't liberated. Though he aptly criticises overlooking the actual text to demonise Joanne, it's just as possible to overlook the text in order to preserve an overly generous interpretation that you prefer. Nevertheless, I do think Rory is correct that the reinterpretation is overlooking something. By analysing Potter through the lens of Joanne, we're kind of working from the conclusion backwards. If we didn't know about Joanne, would we still come to the same conclusion? It is true that there are many contradictions in Potter's messaging, which probably should have gotten more notice at the time. But my honest answer to the question, should we have known, is we kinda did know. Okay, we didn't make the connection to bigotry, obviously we didn't know about Joanne. But the criticisms the reinterpretation makes have been knocking around for a while. Matt Zeitlin wrote about the goblins and anti-Semitism in 2007, Simon Walters lambasted the fat phobia in 2006, and, plot twist, a lot of the essays I quoted about house elves were actually written years ago. Barrett in 2012, Carey in 2004 and 2009, and Kellner in 2010. Recent events may have shed more light on these criticisms, more people are aware of them, but it's wrong to suggest they weren't part of the conversation already. The reinterpretation doesn't actually offer any new evidence, it just reinterprets the evidence which was already there. So, let's spin our time turners back to those heady days when Harambe was still with us, when Netflix came in the mail, and when we were still unburdened by the eldritch truth of Joanne. How did we deal with these criticisms then? Interpretation 3. The original. People have been trying to explain Pottermania for decades, and I don't claim to know why it happened either. It sure as hell wasn't because Joanne is just that good of a writer, or that Potter did something which no other children's books have done before. Probably it was just the right book, doing the right combination of things, getting the right kind of attention at the right time. YouTuber Verily Bitchy argues that a lot of Potter's success was manufactured by AOL Time Warner, who could use their media empire to relentlessly promote Potter directly to impressionable children. And sure, that definitely fanned the flames, but there was still something about Potter which started the fire in the first place. I first discovered Potter not from advertising, but from my classmates, word of mouth. And though it may surprise you, I was not a popular kid. I was rarely motivated by peer pressure. Nevertheless, I would stay up late reading those books till the small hours of the morning because I just couldn't put them down. That's not something Joanne or advertising can make children do. I know it's gauche to give Joanne compliments these days, but it would be reductive to claim there weren't some things Potter did well. Relatable characters, solid mysteries, wry and imaginative world building, a darkening and maturing narrative. And when it comes to interpreting meaning, I think these elements, the vibes of a story, count for more than they're often given credit for.
A setting's strength is not only logistics, it's also bum-ba-da-bum-bum-bum-bum, and a owl, and it flies in the wands, and like the little boarding school uniforms. All of that stuff actually has, I would say, a heavier pragmatic weight on what brings joy to your players.
Positive criticism tends to focus more on emotion, whereas negative criticism generally attacks logic. Neither approach is necessarily better than the other. You can blinker yourself to plot holes just as you can logic your way out of the fun. But often, criticisms about internal logic stem from a critic's failure to suspend their disbelief, which may have a deeper root cause than the criticism itself. And I think the same principle applies to how we read a story's themes, messaging, and ideology. The reinterpretation basically argues that the surface-level reading of Potter is incorrect, but the root cause of this criticism is Joanne. Because of what we now know, we must conclude the core message of love and acceptance is, on some level, insincere, and the contradictions to its messaging are proof of that. Whereas the original interpretations had no reason to doubt the surface-level reading. When a text unsubtly claims to oppose bigotry, it's hard to ignore that. So even though many critics identified the same contradictions with just as much clarity, they could still suspend their disbelief about the core message. Thus, the contradictions were generally viewed as missteps in an otherwise well-meaning story. I mean, sometimes critics accuse Joanne of hypocrisy, but often these issues were identified as common tropes. as I've said, Joanne wasn't the only person at the time writing stereotypically about other cultures or doing invisible queer representation. Critics and academics often treated Potter as a high-profile case study, a text with a progressive message which nonetheless falls prey to common assumptions and biases. Okay, but the slavery? The essentialism? Even 20 years ago, critics struggled to explain these things in a story which also allegorizes racism as the ultimate evil. Often, critics who identified these issues couldn't explain them beyond whatever Joanne was trying to say with this, I guess she failed. Suman Gupta did say it was best to consider Potter's confused analogies as mistakes, but only because the alternative would be far worse. Yeah, no kidding. And I think many critics of the time were a bit too trusting. When Brycken Carey first wrote about the house elves after Goblet of Fire, he understandably assumed that Joanne would address the issues of their enslavement in later books, only to return to the subject being like, oh, guess not. But there's one essay from this time which does attempt to explain these issues, Elaine Ostry's Accepting Mudbloods. She identifies many of the same contradictions in Potter, but argues these are inherited from fairy tales. For instance, fairy tales generally oppose materialism. These were stories told by peasants, so they tend to be about poor, humble folk who value modesty over wealth. Cinderella is a servant who just wants to go to a party. Belle asks her father for a humble rose, unlike the expensive gifts her siblings desire. And yet, as is typical of fairy tale endings, both of these heroines wind up marrying into the aristocracy. So, it's a virtue not to desire wealth and status, yet that virtue is rewarded by getting wealth and status anyway. Potter has the same contradiction. Like Cinderella, Harry starts as a humble servant, abused by his family. No money is spent on him, and his prospects are low. Then, he's whisked away to a fairy tale world where he has wealth and status, and a fancy broomstick. Modesty is still a virtue. Harry chooses not to align with the wealthy elite, instead choosing friends without wealth or status, respectively. But it's still a very materialistic story. There's a whole chapter in the first book about Harry using his newfound wealth to go on a shopping spree. Similarly, fairy tales have their own contradictions of beauty bias. It's wrong to judge by appearances. A frog may be a prince, an old crone may be an enchantress, etc. And yet, fairy tales also tend to associate beauty with goodness, handsome knights and fair maidens, which has a racist connotation too, light versus dark. Ostry argues that all fairy tales suffer an innate contradiction between radicalism and traditionalism. While Potter may attempt to advocate radical ideas of social change, it finds itself limited by the folklore and fairy tales it's cribbing from. Ostry doesn't see these contradictions as purely a failing on Joanne's part, but instead a failing of fairy tales as a genre. Yeah, I don't think reliance on fairy tale traditions sufficiently explains all the contradictions in Potter. Again, how hard would it have been not to portray house elves as inherent slaves? Ostry does say Joanne is not writing as radical a fairy tale as other writers of the time. Nevertheless, I agree that Potter is limited by making a point about equality and meritocracy in a traditional story about a chosen hero. These ideas were never gonna mesh. So how come this didn't break Potter right from the start? Well, for the same reason they don't break other fairy tales. Ostry quotes literary critic Peter Hollindale, who argues children's stories are inherently didactic. They're educational in some way. Even if it's not an Aesop-style fable, when an adult author writes to children, there's always going to be an element of imparting knowledge to the next generation. Which means the core message, the lesson, carries a lot of weight in determining the meaning of a text. Hollindale's main argument draws a distinction in children's literature between three kinds of ideology: active ideology, passive ideology, and what others have later dubbed organic ideology. Active ideology exists in the surface level reading, what the text explicitly states as its lesson. In Potter, it's that bigotry is evil and love is the greatest power. Passive ideology lies in the text's assumptions and biases, what the text says without necessarily meaning to. like Potter's assumed essentialism, the lack of systemic change. And organic ideology is found in the ideas the text draws from the world, our culture, language, and history. In Potter, that'd be fairy tales, folklore, the culture of boarding schools, British imperialism, and so on. Barth talked about this too. One reason a text cannot have a singular voice of the author is because authors create meanings by drawing on the voices of authors who came before them. And Hollendale says it's actually not unlikely that active and passive ideologies will contradict each other. Because in didactic children's literature, new and radical ideas can only work in active ideology. If the lesson isn't communicated on the active surface level, a child reader might not recognize it. And in order for the lesson to be persuasive, you've also got to meet the kids where they're at, which means making some passive assumptions. Radical ideas are only effective when contrasted against something a child reader finds familiar, like fairy tales, or the schoolyard, or modern society in general, which come with their own organic ideologies. All of which is to say, a text never has just one ideology.
In numerous commentaries on children's fiction, not to mention many novels themselves, a customary error is to make the wrong implicit analogy by treating ideology as if it were a political policy, when in fact it is a climate of belief.
Potter isn't putting forth a coherent ideological manifesto, it's a hodgepodge of ideas and attitudes interacting and colliding, sometimes in contradictory ways. That doesn't mean we can simply ignore the contradictions. The specific ways Potter contradicts itself could still be attributed to a skill issue on Joanne's part. Nevertheless, the fact it has these contradictions doesn't necessarily mean we have to interpret the active message as insincere. It's not one ideology or the other, it's both. It's all of them. Still, the concern Hollendale expresses, which some critics of Potter have echoed, is that young readers won't have the critical skills to decipher and separate passive ideologies. Radical ideas may not be persuasive in passive ideology, but traditional ideas may be reinforced. Children might absorb them unconsciously. Considering the popularity of Potter, the worry is this could happen on a large scale. But after nearly 30 years of Potter, it's pretty self-evident that hasn't happened. Millennials, the Harry Potter generation, are statistically more socially liberal, pro-diversity, and anti-capitalist than older generations. And there's some evidence to suggest the popularity of Potter might have something to do with that. In 2009, the University of Vermont conducted a nationwide survey of millennial college students. Participants who had read some or all of the Potter books, about 2/3 of them, were more likely to support tolerance and equality, to oppose authoritarianism, and to be more politically active. And a 2014 study, published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology, found that reading Potter to children and teenagers, particularly passages concerning prejudice and discrimination towards fantasy creatures and Muggle-borns, resulted in more positive attitudes towards marginalized people in real life, such as immigrants and refugees. Of course, correlation does not imply causation. Hollendale takes care to mention that young people are not empty vessels. They bring their own ideologies to a text. And the 2014 study also found the effect relied on participants identifying with Harry as a character and disidentifying with Voldemort. I'm sure it's true Pottermania impacted us in some significant ways, but it may also be true that Potter appealed to millennial ideologies just as much as it informed them. Who can say? The reason I bring up these surveys is because they demonstrate to me that the interpretation of Potter children usually make, and the one the fandom has built itself around, is one which prioritizes the active ideology. Potter's core message of anti-essentialism and anti-bigotry are assumed to be the intent. Therefore, any contradictions to that message must not be the intent. Looking back at Potter fan communities of the time, at least the ones that still exist, fans often discussed Potter's contradictions, making a lot of the same arguments academics and reinterpreters do. Although the fat phobia was often defended just like MuggleNet did, with a list of other overweight characters. And we've already gone over why that's not an excuse. Often, fans acknowledged they overlooked the book's problems as children, and it's only by revisiting the stories as adults that they've begun to question them. Potter's enduring popularity and its decade-long release schedule meant there was a lot of time to develop these critical skills, and as the fandom aged, the way they resolved these contradictions was to sort of overrule them. Sometimes this is done unconsciously. For instance, a lot of people appear to misremember Hermione and SPEW as being framed more sympathetically than it was. But even when people identify that house elves were not liberated and Hermione's activism was largely played for a joke, they decide that Hermione was right actually. House elves should be liberated, and that is what she went on to do in her career. Similarly, with the fandom's practice of self-sorting into Hogwarts houses, many decided that no, Slytherin is not the evil house, it's just that cunning, ambition, and loyalty happen to be traits which Death Eaters value. So they deconstruct the essentialist nature of the sorting, at least partially, in a way the text doesn't. And I know we already criticized people for making interpretations not based on the actual text, but I wouldn't call this a misreading. It's another negotiated reading. Fans correctly identify the core message and reject those other parts of the text which contradict it. Instead of interpreting what Joanne meant to say, they're more like, I think I know what you meant to say. And you may think this is being generous to the text, but before we had a reason to doubt the series' message, nobody could really say these interpretations were wrong. Well, that's great, but now we do have a reason to doubt the series' message. Now we can be sure that isn't what Joanne meant to say. Can we be sure? No matter how much we learn about Joanne, we can't know what was in her mind when she wrote Potter. Even if she outright tells us what she meant, we can still doubt her, like when she compares Death Eaters to trans activists. We can still argue that what she intended and what the text says are different things. It may seem foolish to disagree with an author about their own text. Famously, Fahrenheit 451 is widely interpreted and taught as a cautionary tale about censorship, even though author Ray Bradbury has insisted he was actually criticizing television and mass media.
I was lecturing at Cal Fullerton once and they misinterpreted Fahrenheit 451, and after about half an hour of arguing with them, telling them that they were wrong, I said, "You! I've never used that word before," and I left the classroom.
However, while I marvel at the sheer brass neckery of telling an author he's wrong about his own book to his face, I'm sorry, Ray, but if this many people say your book is about censorship to the point that's sometimes printed on the actual cover, can you really claim that meaning isn't there?
You're gonna look at me and you're gonna tell me that I'm wrong? Am I wrong?
Maybe nobody's wrong. If an author says Greedo shot first, and the readers are like, no, Han shot first actually, there's no way to prove which meaning is quote-unquote correct. Both meanings exist now. And if readers disagree with an author's intent so strongly that they make new versions of the text supporting the reading they prefer, that's also going to change the way we read the original. This happens with Potter too. Needless to say, shipping was rampant at the height of Pottermania, and a very popular pairing was Neville and Luna. But even though Joanne specifically debunked that ship, even though in a Q&A she said, Neville marries Hannah Abbott, actually, when the final film came out.
You haven't seen Luna, have you? Luna? I'm mad for her. I think it's about time I told her, since we'll probably both be dead by dawn.
I mean, that's all we get, except for this shot. But since there's nothing to contradict this in the books, who's to say you can't read them this way too? The final sentence of Bart's essay argues not only for the death of the author, but also for the birth of the reader. Bart says meanings are created not when the author writes a text, but when the reader reads it. If a text is written in the woods and there's nobody around to read it, does it still mean anything? Again, I cannot claim to know why Pottermania happened, but I think one thing that definitely worked in its favour is that there's plenty of scope for reader interpretation. There's a lot of stuff in Potter. There's a ton of characters, a rich cocktail of folklore and fairy tale, a contradictory climate of beliefs, as well as a lot of details hinted at but never expanded upon. As a result, Potter can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Potter became the phenomenon it did, not solely because of the meanings Joanne intentionally put into it, but also because of the meanings readers found and brought to it. Okay, but reinterpreters are readers too. The meanings they find are just as valid. But so long as we're killing the author, there's another reader interpretation that's just as relevant. Interpretation 4. The queer reading. I think we can be certain Joanne didn't intend a queer reading of Potter. I mean, I guess she tried with her werewolves. She's explicitly said she was using lycanthropy to allegorize stigmatized illnesses like HIV and AIDS. The way Remus Lupin is shunned by wizarding society not only echoes that stigma, but also homophobia in general. And the shame Lupin feels echoes internalized homophobia, denying himself happiness because he doesn't feel he deserves it.
I'm not being ridiculous, said Lupin steadily. Tonks deserves somebody young and whole.
Sure, he enters a literal heterosexual relationship, but metaphorically, he resembles a gay man. There's a reason so many people ship him with Sirius.
Listen to you two quarrelling like an old married couple.
However, as is typical for Joanne, the metaphor is clumsy. When Lupin's lycanthropy is made public, he is forced to leave Hogwarts under threat of prejudiced parents fearing their child being taught by a werewolf. But while the text frames this as unfair and ignorant, it doesn't quite frame it as unfounded.
And after last night, I see their point. I could have bitten any of you. That must never happen again.
Because Lupin cannot control his lupine behaviour, his animalistic queerness thus becomes a very real threat to the children of Hogwarts, as he himself realises prior to removing himself from contact with them.
We could read Lupin agreeing with this prejudice as internalised shame as well. But the truth is, there is a genuine danger. Werewolves are uncontrollably violent when they transform, which, as academics Tyson Pugh and David L. Wallace observe, validates the fear that werewolves should not be around children, uncomfortably connecting Potter's werewolves with pederasty. A connection only worsened by the introduction of Fenrir Greyback, a werewolf who specifically preys on children. In creating this villain, Joanne is drawing upon homophobic fears, which hardly helps destigmatize the illnesses she's allegorizing. Gee, thanks for that, Joanne. Then, of course, there's Dumbledore, the series' only kind of canonically queer character. Although, I suppose Charlie Weasley could be read as asexual?
Charlie had children or married. No, I don't think Charlie's gay. Just more interested in dragons than women.
In both cases, their queerness is purely paratextual. It's only mentioned in external sources, like interviews with Joanne. Whereas in the actual books, we never learn anything about Charlie's relationships. And Dumbledore, well, it's not true there's no indication of Dumbledore's homosexuality, but it's flimsy. Of course, there's his brief but intense friendship with Grindelwald, sending each other letters in the dead of night. He's somewhat femme. He has an unapologetic fondness for knitting patterns. Then there's Rita Skeeter implying Dumbledore had an unnatural interest in Harry, once again evoking pederasty. Of course, we the reader know this is just sensationalist gossip, but it nonetheless hints at Dumbledore having a secret sexual life that even in-narrative characters speculate about. And then there's Dumbledore's close relationship with Elphius Doge, the guy who wrote his obituary, in which he describes having a mutual attraction with Dumbledore as fellow outsiders, an attraction described by Aberforth with a particular anal connotation. Yeah, it's flimsy. To the point Pugh argues Dumbledore's gayness only exists in spectral form. It's not just obscured from the reader, but seemingly from our protagonist as well. Perhaps because it's something Joanne feels children are best left ignorant of, or perhaps because it might complicate Dumbledore's mentoring of Harry into the traditional male hero, as he leads Harry away from queerness towards heteronormativity. Harry succeeds where Dumbledore failed, and Dumbledore's failure is tied to his queerness. His love for Grindelwald blinded him to danger, leading to the death of his sister and for Dumbledore to give up queerness, becoming apparently chaste for the rest of his life. By contrast, Harry does protect the women in his life, he doesn't give in to the temptations of the Hallows, and he's able to surpass death into the heroic afterlife of heterosexual marriage with 3 kids. It's basically saying, to become the ideal hero, you need to be straight.
I only feared that you would fail as I had failed. Only dreaded that you would make my mistakes. I crave your pardon, Harry. I have known for some time now that you are the better man.
I admit it's not great optics, but I don't quite agree with Pugh's take. For one, I'm not sure that Harry is a traditional male hero, we'll get to that, but also, I don't think Dumbledore's mentorship has much to do with Harry's sexual maturation into straightness. Pugh's main argument relies on this whole analysis of Harry's inner beasts, which I don't buy at all, so let's not get into it. Where I do agree with Pugh is that, in Potter, queerness is conspicuous in its absence. Even though we see a lot of the sexual politics of Hogwarts students, there's never any indication any of them might be queer, which, for a school of teenagers, is weird. And maybe that's a sign of the time it was written. Queer representation in children's media has come a long way. Nevertheless, Pugh points out Joanne usually has no qualms about including taboo topics. She just does it euphemistically. There are overt references to swearing, vulgarity, alcoholism, sex, at least second base, and even bestiality. But there are no similar indications of queerness, even with Dumbledore. The only literal acknowledgements of queerness are 1. A homophobic insult.
Who's Cedric? Your boyfriend?
And 2. A no-homo joke.
Well, he's not my type, but he'll do.
So, from all this, we might conclude that any queer interpretations readers make of Potter are pure projection and have nothing to do with the literal text. But we would be wrong. Potter has, or used to have anyway, a strong queer following. Asia Romano wrote about how Potter was instrumental in realising their genderqueer identity. Eden Ariel Gordon wrote about how Potter was a comfort growing up bisexual in a place which felt hostile to her identity. Dana Aaliyah Levinson and Jackson Bird each wrote about how Potter and the fandom helped them accept themselves as trans.
I remember the pang I felt when reading the chapter about the Mirror of Erised, because I knew what it would show me if I were to look into it. Myself as a girl looking back at me.
While I was nervous about coming out to some relatives and acquaintances, I never doubted that the Harry Potter fan community would accept me for who I was.
Which is what makes Joanne's gender-critical activism such a slap in the face. It's not just that she's contradicting the book's apparent message, it's that, for a lot of queer fans, her books played a role in understanding or accepting their queer identities. Despite how conspicuously absent queerness is in the series, queer people have nonetheless found queer meanings that are very real to them. Like Bart says, a text is not made of a single voice. Even if an author doesn't intend a queer meaning, they may still unwittingly reflect or adapt queer meanings which already exist in our culture.
Queer readings aren't alternative readings, wishful or willful misreadings, or reading too much into things readings. They result from the recognition and articulation of the complex range of queerness that has been in popular culture texts and their audiences all along.
And Potter is playing in a very queer sandbox. Queer culture has long been drawn towards fantasy and the supernatural, because queer people tend to identify with the other. Magic is transgressive and feared by society, often kept secret, whilst also being literally empowering, offering tantalizing possibilities of escape, retribution, and transformation. Likewise, queer people often sympathize with monsters. Maybe because queerness itself has often been portrayed as monstrous, there's a long history of queer-coded fantasy villains, or because monsters can serve as allegories for queer experiences, not just to represent being marginalized or demonized, but also to take joy in difference, in individual expression, in non-conformity. Fantasy is all about imagining ways our society and culture could be different.
The intrinsic weirdness and weirdness that comes with being this kind of person can shift people's lives and perspectives towards alternative and transgressive ways of thinking. all of which is conducive to connecting with monstrous, strange, and magical things.
So the moment Joanne began writing about these subjects, whether she realised it or not, she was encoding queer meanings into her text. Needless to say, identity is a huge theme in Potter. The moment Joanne introduces other types of human into her narrative, not just wizards, but werewolves, ghosts, vampires, animagi, half giants, half goblins, half Veela, she can't help but raise questions of identity. And when she introduces prejudice against certain types, she also can't help dipping a toe into the queer lexicon.
I am what I am, and I'm not ashamed.
You can view the first book as essentially a coming out story. I mean, Harry literally comes out of a closet. Upon reaching adolescence, Harry learns the truth of his own identity, his intrinsic unusualness which separates him from ordinary society. And he learns this otherness ties him to a community of kindred people, where he finds the acceptance and family he didn't get at home. However, his newfound community lives in secret, in an underground world mapped onto the ordinary one. And wizards use a coded language to find and communicate with each other.
Packed with muggles, of course. Come on.
Which mirrors the way queer people build their communities right under the noses of straight society, especially in the days before gay liberation. And if we trust Dumbledore's notes in the Tales of Beedle the Bard, wizard secrecy is partly due to fear of persecution from muggles. Certainly, the Dursleys' fear of magic is easily compared to homophobia. Once again, it uses the same lexicon.
We swore when we took him in we'd put a stop to that rubbish, said Uncle Vernon. Swore we'd stamp it out of him.
When Harry returns to the Muggle world, he must hide his wizardly tendencies, not just by refraining from magic, but by disguising that part of himself. The Dursleys demand that he doesn't even mention it. In Chamber of Secrets, he literally hides, being forced to remain silent in his bedroom while the Dursleys have visitors. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he must go along with the more palatable lie Uncle Vernon told Aunt Marge about him. In order to survive a hostile family environment, Harry must mask his true identity. Likewise, wizards dress differently to muggles. Harry has to change his presentation in order to pass in the muggle world. And to the Dursleys, presenting as a wizard is a sign of shameful non-conformity with muggle society.
Aunt Petunia whimpered piteously. It could not have been plainer that she was thinking of what the neighbours would say if they caught sight of these people marching up the garden path.
The comparison is much less clumsy than a lot of Joanne's intentional allegories. The way Harry experiences his own identity and how he navigates the borders of these two worlds is incredibly relatable for many queer people, of all queer identities. And when viewed through this allegory, Potter becomes a celebration of queerness. Harry's wizardry not only connects him to a community, but also to a life of adventure, fun, and wonder. For queer children, it allows them to vicariously experience acceptance and, well, pride, at a time in their lives where that might not yet be within reach.
The Potter books celebrate a revolt against accepted conventional life, against the world of the Muggles, who slavishly follow societal rules without ever thinking about whether they are right or wrong, if they make sense or not. They are, at heart, an attack on the very idea of normalcy. The Harry Potter books tell children that being normal is dull, unexciting, unimaginative, and deadening.
So, you, Joanne. You wrote a queer story without meaning to, you idiot. Sure, that was how Michael Bronski felt after book 4, but once the series was complete, he changed his tune.
After 7 long novels, the final vision Rowling leaves us with is that these great queer magical people evolve into nothing more than Quidditch mums and slightly vacant suburban dads.
Which is hardly surprising. Potter's queer elements, though definitely present, are clearly unintentional. Is it any wonder the plot winds up contradicting them? For example, the reason Asia Romano identified so heavily with Potter is because they read the character Tonks as a fellow genderqueer person.
A shapeshifter with spiky pink hair, a punk rock aesthetic, and an insistence on being called by her gender-neutral last name. I was certain that Rowling had written a canonically gender-fluid character.
And yet, As the books progress, Tonks becomes more feminized, softer, less feisty, more emotional. She accepts a more traditional feminine role by becoming a wife and a mother. She allows her husband to call her the more feminine Dora. The suggestion here is that genderqueerness or gender dysphoria is just a phase, an idea Joanne specifically argued for in her Turf Wars essay. As Asia puts it,
she deliberately created Tonks as a dysphoric individual so that the character could grow out of her dysphoria, subtly perpetuating the transphobic narrative that gender dysphoria is a choice.
Okay, look. I really don't want to invalidate Romano's reading. You absolutely can interpret Tonks as genderqueer. She definitely does have a disappointingly normative conclusion, and it is uncomfortably reflective of Joanne's arguments about gender dysphoria. I'm just not convinced it was deliberate. While Tonks does assume the role of wife and mother, she also refuses to stay home during the Battle of Hogwarts. And the name Tonks objected to in the past was her full name, Nymphadora, whereas Dora is the pet name her family call her. It is irritatingly gendered, but Lupin's use of it may be intended to imply a greater intimacy with Tonks. The real sticking point for me, though, is the shape-shifting. That's another supernatural trope associated with queerness. It naturally suggests blurring boundaries of identity, which lends a lot of credibility to a genderqueer reading of Tonks. She uses her shape-shifting powers not only to present as alternative, but also to change her presentation depending on her mood. Some people, not Romano admittedly, incorrectly claim Tonks loses these powers, which does appear to be what happens in the movies. She permanently loses her pink hair for unexplained reasons. But in the books, though she does lose her powers, it's clearly signposted as a temporary symptom of depression. In the final book, she gets her pink hair back. We see her use her shapeshifting at Bill and Fleur's wedding, and she passes these powers on to her son. It never stops being an important part of her identity. And if we resurrect the author for a moment, it's likely Joanne wasn't even aware of genderqueer as a thing when she wrote Tonks. Genderqueer people have always existed, of course, but the idea was only just entering mainstream awareness by the time the books finished. For a boomer like Joanne, it's more likely she wrote Tonks to evoke punks, probably without realizing the queer associations with that subculture. There are a lot of similar arguments these days, identifying things in Potter which could allegorize trans or queer people in a negative light, like Tonks or Rita Skeeter. Even Voldemort's monstrous transformation could be likened to a transphobe's idea of transition. Dumbledore does insist on calling him Tom, which could be seen as dead-naming him. These interpretations are valid, but they generally rely on a fairly sophisticated understanding of queer experiences, which I don't believe Joanne has, at the time or now. Considering Joanne's track record with clumsy allegories, I don't think we can be certain she did these deliberately. Okay, pretty damning that interpreting transphobic allegories in Joanne's work is still giving her too much credit. Nevertheless, these interpretations aren't coming from nothing. There's a constant tension in Potter between its queer elements and heteronormativity, especially when it comes to the series' portrayal of gender. For starters, it's a very male-centered story. Of course, Harry is male, but so are most of the important characters. According to YouTuber Caroline Easam, if you rank the characters by number of mentions, only 28 of the top 100 are female. And most female characters are consigned to roles with less agency and authority.
Harry is supported by the dignified wizard Dumbledore and a colourful cast of male characters. Girls, when they're not downright silly or unlikable, are helpers, enablers, and instruments. No girl is brilliantly heroic the way Harry is. No woman is experienced and wise like Professor Dumbledore.
Men are headmasters, government officials, and dragon tamers, while women are mothers, housewives, and at best, teachers. Even brilliant Hermione, Schuffer observes, is usually presented as an irritating, bossy know-it-all who struggles to gain the boys' respect. Despite being a fellow Gryffindor, she's not rebellious and daring like the boys are. She's more similar to other female Gryffindors, like Professor McGonagall and Mrs. Weasley, in that she's a voice of sensible rule following.
This last division illustrates the general message of the series. Men are interesting, women are good.
But there are also things which challenge this. Bellatrix and Umbridge aren't mothers or wives, and as villains, they have tremendous agency. And despite Tonks's shortcomings, as an Auror, she also serves as a role model for Harry. What's more, mothers and housewives are capable of great feats of power. Molly, Fleur, and Tonks remain active members of the Order. And when Bellatrix is defeated, though the natural choice would be an act of vengeance by Harry, Lupin, or Neville, it's Molly who does the deed. A mother protecting her daughter is more powerful than the most committed Death Eater. Magic is a great equalizer. In the wizarding world, strength and power is determined by magical skill, which is not dependent on gender. Despite drawing on the traditions of British boarding schools, Hogwarts is co-ed. Even Quidditch, a dangerous contact sport, is played and captained by both boys and girls together. And Hogwarts generally makes no distinction between witches and wizards. Magical practices that are traditionally feminine, brewing magic potions, growing magic plants, gazing at crystal balls, even flying on broomsticks, are taught to everybody, without gender even being remarked upon.
The cross-gendered setting of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter books appears to be both a fantastically post-feminist world where sexism no longer undermines women's power and agency, and one in which a post-feminist facade merely camouflages the novel's rather traditional gender roles and its erasure of sexual orientation difference.
Tyson Pugh wasn't wrong that Harry's story is heteronormative. He's a traditional Arthurian hero, an ordinary orphan who discovers he's extraordinary, prophesied to rise from obscurity to greatness. He follows the hero's journey, taking him from boyhood to manhood, surpassing his mentors to become the masculine ideal the world needs, the perfect man who can defeat the great evil single-handed.
Harry, it's you that has to go on, I know it. Not me, not Hermione, you.
However, as academics Ximena Gallardo-C and C. Jason Smith observe, Harry's story also resembles feminine fairy tales, most notably Cinderella. Not only because both characters are whisked away from domesticity to a world of magic and adventure, but also because that transformation is cyclical. Unlike Arthurian stories, both must periodically leave the magical world behind and return to the drudgery of home as if it never happened.
Appearing within a traditionally feminine narrative structure, Harry, in essence, is a boy caught in a girl's story.
Harry Potter? Genderqueer icon? I mean, kind of. Harry's body is inhabited by both the feminine soul of his mother's sacrifice and the masculine soul of Voldemort's curse. He's positioned between Ron and Hermione, who respectively represent masculine and feminine impulses. And despite being a male hero, it is the feminine choices Harry is most often rewarded for. He does not succumb to his masculine desire to kill Sirius to avenge his parents, and is rewarded with the truth and a godfather. He repeatedly opts for the defensive Expelliarmus spell, a decision the Order criticizes, and yet it's this spell which finally destroys Voldemort. By contrast, masculine impulses are often punished, sneaking out of bed to duel Draco, winning the Triwizard Tournament, rushing to the Ministry to save Sirius. Ultimately, both impulses are required to defeat Voldemort. Harry wins mastery over the Horcruxes through active pursuit and self-sacrifice, and wins mastery over the Hallows through inactive resistance to power. The best we can say about the portrayal of gender in Potter is that it's conflicted, between queerness and normativity, between feminism and conservatism. In other words, between radicalism and traditionalism. Gallardo-C and Smith end their second essay with two interpretations of the series' epilogue. The first mirrors Bronsky's view that it's a heteronormative restoration of the nuclear family, a typical happily ever after return to traditional values. The second observes that, while Ron continues to uphold the rivalry between houses, the lesson Harry imparts to his son is, essentially, a rejection of dividing binaries. Gallardo-C and Smith express their preference for the latter, but cannot resolve this conflict. Both interpretations are correct. So, if there's no wrong answer, do we just get to choose which we like best? No, we choose which one is true. We can't just ignore the book's flaws because they're inconvenient to our preferred reading. But we also can't ignore all the other meanings in Potter. There's stuff in there which stands in direct opposition to the politics Joanne upholds now. Those meanings are the ones I like. That's what makes this story important to me. And I don't think we should give Joanne the power to take that away.
If you found anything in these stories that resonated with you and helped you at any time in your life, then that is between you and the book that you read, and it is sacred. And in my opinion, nobody can touch that. It means to you what it means to you, and I hope that Rowling's comments will not taint that too much.
Well, maybe that works for an individual interpretation, but the question is, what do we do with Potter? Joanne may not get to decide what Potter means for you, but who decides what it means for all of us? Part 3. What does Harry Potter mean now? In the wake of Joanne falling prey to the black mold, the core Potter fandom widely staked out its intent to forge ahead without her. Potter fansite The Leaky Cauldron issued a statement of solidarity with trans people, promising to no longer link to Joanne's website or use images of her, and now displays a permanent trans flag lightning scar on its homepage. Other fansites, such as MuggleNet and the Harry Potter Lexicon, echoed this statement, and a number of the fandom's biggest contributors expressed their desire to keep the fandom alive, whilst urging their followers to stop paying for Potter.
We created the fandom, and we created the magic and community in that fandom. That is ours to keep.
I don't want to give J.K. Rowling the satisfaction of taking away from me something that I loved as a kid.
And there's a part of me that thinks, yeah, Joanne. Potter is bigger than she is. It's outgrown her. It doesn't belong to her anymore. It belongs to all of us. It's ours.
Wait, I don't have to leave. This is my part of the ship. You leave.
The fandom has always engaged with Potter in a transformative way. The number of trans-themed Potter fanfics on AO3 and similar sites have exploded in recent years, with what Ben Cromwell calls spite fics. He notes that while these fanfics are motivated by outrage at Joanne, the content doesn't actually involve her, instead focusing on themes of kindness and acceptance for trans people in the setting of the wizarding world. It's a form of protest which seeks to change and reclaim what this story means.
Trans rights! Harry Potter shouted. Hell yeah! Hermione agreed. Of course, Ron said. We believe that everyone's rights matter here. And by the way, this is canon, Harry said. We canonically support trans people.
So perhaps the way the fandom survives is to ignore the author, and instead rewrite these stories for ourselves, create our own preferred canon by salvaging the ideas we like and discarding those we don't. Is it possible we can steal Potter back from Joanne? No. I mean, more power to these fic writers. By all means, we should try and reclaim Potter's queerer and more progressive meanings. But there has never been an author so connected to her books. Once the Pottermania fire was lit, it was fueled, in part, by Joanne's rags to riches story, the captivating idea of J.K. Rowling, the single mother on benefits whose charming book about a boy wizard made her a multi-millionaire. And while that's a true story, it's also been fictionalized, simplified, dramatized as part of the Potter mythology. In Suman Gupta's book, Rereading Harry Potter, he draws a distinction between Joanne Rowling, the real-life human, and J.K. Rowling, the capital A author, arguing it's the latter who bears responsibility for her work. Joanne may have physically written the books, but when we read them, J.K. is the one we attribute them to. J.K. is the one we know from press or interviews, or simply from imagining her voice when we read her words. As such, Gupta says the real-life author is irrelevant. With one condition.
Those questions might become relevant if the real-life Rowling did or does anything to clash with a constructed author Rowling.
Yeah, I think she might have. Gupta wrote this in 2003, and it's chilling to read now. He was confident the real-life Joanne would have no trouble living up to an idea as mild-mannered and admirable as J.K. Rowling.
The mythology of Rowling as the constructed author is a quieter one. It is that of a woman, a mother, a lover of children, a charitable person who is seen to write as such. It would take a very old-fashioned and hardened Thatcherite Tory to find herself caught out by the mythologized author, who was a single mother on the dole and made good and became one of the richest and most famous persons in Britain.
You had one job, Joanne. You couldn't just log off. So J.K. Rowling is dead, because Joanne Rowling killed her. It's not just that Joanne's current politics contradict Potter's message, it's that now we know J.K. Rowling didn't write these books. The reason the reinterpretation exists is to figure out who did. But Joanne is just as much a construct as J.K. was. The reinterpretation is imagining a new capital A author to replace the old one, which comes with a lot of the same problems. The true story of Joanne is also fictionalized, simplified, and dramatized. But then, that's just how we read. Killing the author is impossible. Sure, we can try and read Potter as if we found it in a time capsule from another universe without Joanne, but whenever we read a text, even if we know nothing about the person who wrote it, we still know somebody wrote it. We're still communicating with someone. The reader may be the one who creates meanings, but we can't do that without also creating some version of the author. So, if our understanding of an author changes, our understanding of their work can't help but change with them. A text doesn't exist independently of the language, media, and culture which surrounds it. Both J.K. and Joanne are part of that culture. Even though the literal text hasn't changed, what these books mean has. That's why this feels icky to read now. The contradictions, the essentialism, the systemic injustices are harder to overlook. The message of anti-bigotry is harder to explain when you know these are the words of an actual bigot. In my opinion, you cannot disconnect these books from who Joanne is and what Joanne does. It sucks, but the meaning of Potter is always going to be tainted by her. But that also doesn't mean our original interpretations were wrong. Back when J.K. was still alive and well, that was the common reading. There were always contradictions and problematic ideas which were and are worth discussing. But we as readers decided this was a story about love and acceptance for those who are different. So that is what it meant. And those meanings don't just go away now we've found new ones. A lot of reinterpreters reassure their audience that it's okay to have complicated feelings about Potter. But I'll go one further. It's not only okay, it's correct. You should have complicated feelings about it. The meaning of Potter has become complicated. Death of the author is not about ignoring the author's influence on a text. It's about looking beyond it so we can see the full complexity of a text's meanings. I don't think Joanne has destroyed our original interpretations. She doesn't have that power. What she has done is force us to look beyond them. And now we have to contend with a less singular and less certain understanding of these books. And that was always going to happen. Maybe not quite this dramatically, but the meanings of a text naturally evolve and change and age and take on new meanings. We've all had the experience of revisiting something we enjoyed in our youth, only to find it doesn't mean the same thing to us anymore. We, the Potter generation, are in our 30s now. It would be weird if we still read these books the same way we did as children, because we change too. The whole world changes. Sure, we can't pretend Potter didn't happen, or that it never meant what it did, but we also can't preserve it in amber. In another timeline, the HBO show might have actually had some power to reinvigorate these stories, to write a better ending for the house elves, or to actually address the injustice of Muggle segregation. Maybe even lean into its queerer elements and become genuinely trans-affirming, to let the story change as we have. But what with Joanne's involvement and the movies still looming large in the public consciousness, the teaser trailer uses the same music, logo, and even the same castle, this is clearly more about cashing in on nostalgia than a sincere attempt to retell this story. The biggest criticism it's received, aside from the backlash to Joanne, are people questioning what the point of it is. As much as the fandom does belong to us, and we have the freedom to do with these stories whatever we want, fandom is fringe. Most people aren't going to choose trans spitefic over mass media. Most people aren't thinking about Potter as much as we do. A lot of normies don't even realize the meaning of Potter has changed. At least, not yet. But the worse Joanne gets, the more we have this conversation, the more complicated people's feelings will get. So, I'm throwing my lot in with Miriam.
Harry Potter is wonderful. I'm very grateful to it. It's over. That's what I think.
One day, of course, the author will actually die. That's not a threat, Twitter, that's just how time works. Maybe then it'll be possible to retell this story in a new and better way. But instead of waiting around for that, we don't actually have to reclaim Potter in order to reclaim what it means. That's already happening. Just as Potter is written with the voices of authors who came before it, so too are new authors writing with Potter's voice. As we know, Potter has had a profound influence on our culture. It inspired more young people's fiction about politics. There's been a wave of young adult stories set in dystopian worlds, with a more critical eye towards systemic problems. It was part of a trend that brought fantasy to the mainstream, with more supernatural allegories, often more robust than the ones in Potter. And the new stories, which are most directly influenced by Potter, are iterating on its ideas, often in ways which address its contradictions.
Because you know you can like learn magic or whatever, and anyone can, but like if anyone can, then no one's special, so you know.
We've been coasting along under the assumption that people are born with certain gifts. What we instead have is a possible worldwide resource of limitless power being hoarded by people who could absolutely share it with any and everyone.
According to the rules, a good witch needs to hocus focus. You can only pick one of the 9 tracks.
But all the tracks are so cool. Is there some sort of enchanted article of clothing that could sort this out for me?
Well, there used to be, but...
Oh, I'm so excited!
And now, I feed!
People often beg Potter fans to read something, anything else, often quite rudely, but they do have a point. There are other stories out there with similar ideas, except more thought through, more curious, more mature, and some of them, the characters even get further than second base. Probably nothing else will recapture that feeling of reading Potter for the first time. But I'm sorry, neither can Potter anymore. Pottermania happened because it was the story we needed at the time. But it's not the story we need now. We don't have to forget about it, we don't have to destroy it, but I think the best thing we can do is take the echoes of the late J.K. Rowling's voice, understanding the good parts and the bad, and use it to make something new. This conversation isn't finished. It's gonna carry on for years. It's gonna carry on in my comments section. Be nice to each other. My feelings on it aren't fully set in stone either. I've rewritten this script several times, and I'm still not 100% sure about everything I've said. Nevertheless, I still believe it's a conversation worth having. Meaning is complicated, but hopefully, if we can understand the complexities, it's easier to let meanings change.
If you want to help support trans people in the UK, please consider donating to the Good Law Project's campaign against the Supreme Court ruling. You could also donate to trans charities, such as Mermaids, Transaxual, or Gendered Intelligence. I'll provide links in the description. And if you'd like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Or consider joining my Patreon, where you can get early access and bonus videos. I'm going to be posting one soon about TERF Twitter mobs and the time I was targeted by one. So join up if you want to see that. Thanks for watching.